Good evening. Thank you for being here. My name is Lori Chesley, and I'm very proud to be the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences here at Grand Rapids Community College. And Grand Rapids Community College is pleased to play a leading role in liberal arts education in West Michigan. Our fine arts programs in theater, music, creative writing, and visual arts feature faculty who are not only wonderful teachers, who nurture students' talents, but also highly respected, award-winning artists themselves. Our programs in the social and behavioral sciences feature faculty who are not only superb educators who pique students' intellectual curiosity through engaging experiences both in and out the classroom, but who are also respected scholars in their disciplines. Our math and science faculty are passionate about promoting science, technology, engineering, and math education and careers to pre-college students, and about providing research and scholarship opportunities for the students who are already with us. Now, lest you think these are simply the unsubstantiated opinions of a highly partial speaker, and I am, please allow me to provide just a few examples. Did you know that GRCC theater students, alumni, faculty, staff, and Spectrum Theater Productions earned 29 Grand Award nominations and won 15 this past year, including Best College Production? Did you know that the Grand Rapids Poet Laureate, David Cope, is a professor of English here at GRCC? That our Physical Sciences Department recently received an NSF grant to purchase state-of-the-art equipment to expand our chemistry curricula and the corresponding research opportunities for our students? Did you know that GRCC has the only community college chapter of the International Geographical Honor Society in the country, led by Dr. Mike DeVivo, who I'm guessing is here somewhere? Did you know that in recent years our faculty have organized and hosted conferences and speaker series on a variety of topics, including peace and reconciliation, gender and sexuality, political science, psychology, teaching biology, writing in the workplace, and most recently, gun violence in America? In the future, when you think about a top-notch liberal arts education, I hope that you think about Grand Rapids Community College. As our president, Steve Ender, has said frequently, GRCC offers the first 2 years of a university education with a community college philosophy. Nowhere is the confluence of outstanding pedagogy and scholarship more apparent than in this very event, the fifth annual Race, Ethnicity, and Identity Conference hosted by GRCC's Social Sciences Department and the GRCC chapter of the International Geographical Honor Society. This interdisciplinary conference has become one of the premier scholarly events on the GRCC academic calendar. If you take a look at the breadth of the program, you will see that it engages GRCC students, faculty, the local community, and international scholars in a rich conversation about issues that have shaped the course of history and that continue to shape our global society. Yes, I am particularly proud of our Social Sciences Department, and I asked that any members of that department who are here tonight would please stand and be recognized. Please. Please. Thank you. And Professor Mike Light in the back, I'm glad you are still standing. I would like to recognize your excellent leadership of this event. Without you, this event would not have happened these 5 years, and so thank you very much. Tonight, Edward J. Blum continues the tradition of inspiring keynote speakers that have been featured at the Race, Ethnicity, and Identity Conference. Speakers that have included Susan Reddick, the co-founder and president of Beyond the 11th, a nonprofit organization that empowers Afghan widows, and Isabel Wilkerson, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration. Dr. Blum is a historian of race and religion in the United States. He is the author of several books, including W.E.B. Du Bois' American Prophet and Reforging the White Republic, Race, Religion, and American Nationalism, 1865 to 1898. Tonight, of course, he is speaking on his latest work, The Color of Christ, The Son of God and the Saga of Race in America, which was named by Publishers Weekly as one of the best books of the year on the subject of religion, and by Booklist as one of the top 10 works of Black history nonfiction. Dr. Blum's books have received many scholarly accolades, as has Dr. Blum himself. For example, he has been recognized twice by the Gustavus Myers Center for the Study of Bigotry and Human Rights, and named a top young historian by the History News Network. He has been a fellow with the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at Harvard University and with the National Endowment for the Humanities. As if all of these things weren't enough, his students speak highly of him as well. In fact, here are a couple of comments. Professor Blum is one of the most enjoyable professors I've ever been involved with. He obviously cares about history, and that passion translates. He's funny and lighthearted, and somehow an hour-long class flies by. And while you were having this great time, you learn a whole lot. And also, I normally have no interest in history, but Professor Blum brought out all the juicy details and made his class extremely interesting, on top of the fact that he was super nice and engaging in his teaching methods. This semester has been one of the best that I've ever had. I really enjoyed having Professor Blum as a teacher, and I hope to have him again. We are also delighted to have Dr. Blum as our teacher tonight. Please join me in welcoming him.
We figure out all the tech. How's that sound? Can you hear me in the back okay? It is such a joy to be here. Thank you to the provost and to the dean, to Mike Light for coordinating everything. This is a real joy for me because The Color of Christ was revised in Grand Rapids as my wife got big to 8 months pregnant, and I was writing for my children about what images of the sacred would they see before they could read sacred text. So I revised the book just about 3 miles away from your campus. So I'm so glad to be here. What I want you to do right now is just think to yourself, what's the first image of Jesus you remember seeing? What was it? Where was it? What's the first one you can recall? And while you're thinking about it, I'm going to share with you a kind of montage, because every good movie should have a montage. We learned that from the South Park guys. Think about that as you're watching this kind of montage of images of Jesus throughout American history. Did any of those images, had you seen any of those before? Were any of them the first image that you recall? You're kind of shaking your head, yes? Which one? That one behind. Anybody know who the artist is? Warner Salmon. 1941 is when it was first painted. It's the most reproduced image of Jesus in global history, world history. If you watch The Help, if you've seen that movie, there's a picture of her dead son, spoiler alert, sorry, and above the son, I know I should have said that before I spoiled the movie, above the picture of the son is Warner Salmon's Head of Christ. So that one there. Any of the other ones that you've seen? Anybody see the hippie Jesus, the one where he's looking directly at you, he looks kind of suntanned? Okay, that one's kind of popular as well from the 60s. So we're going to get to, and we'll talk about your experiences with Jesus, is what's the relationship between these images of Jesus throughout American history and race throughout American history? Because bodies have mattered in America, right? Our Constitution counted certain bodies as 3/5 of a person if you were an enslaved body. You could go to an auction in New Orleans and not buy just produce, but you could buy human flesh. After the American Civil War, what blood you had in heredity would determine what swimming pool you could go to or not go to. In the 20th century, bodies have mattered a lot, right? Cosmetic surgery to bodies, being suntanned. Characters who played Jesus in the early 20th century in movies were in their 40s and 50s. Now, they're in their 30s. Sometimes they look younger. They've gotten tanner. They've gotten stronger. Anybody remember Passion of the Christ when Jim Caviezel, the actor, isn't getting beaten up? How muscular he is. I mean, he's a sexy guy. I want to look like that. And so we've seen in the 20th century our obsessions with beauty or youth have even been mapped on to our thinking of Jesus. There once was a slave spiritual that went, everywhere I go, somebody's talking about Jesus. Well, it seems like today in America, everywhere we go, somebody's talking about what Jesus looked like or didn't look like. Here you can go to an anti-Tea Party rally and observe from kind of Occupy Americans, Obama is not a brown-skinned anti-war socialist who gives away free health care. You're thinking of Jesus. So here, Jesus' brown-skinnedness is connected to a political economy, socialism, and an approach to healthcare, it for free. Or you can grab your cover of Rolling Stone in 2008, when a certain reverend named Jeremiah Wright almost cost Barack Obama the Democratic nomination with his claims. You remember the snippets, "Goddamn America." But then after that, it was Jesus was a poor black man crucified by whites. This is what Reverend Jeremiah Wright said. Well, here's Rolling Stone putting Kanye West, at one point a poor man, a poor black man, but not a poor black man by 2008, as a Christ analog figure here on the cover. Or you can open up a copy of Popular Mechanics, and you can ask forensic scientists to do their work as to what would Jesus have looked like 2,000 years ago. So figure out, you good CSI experts, what would one individual who lived at the crossroads of the known world look like 2,000 years ago? Guess what? Of the 4 biblical biographies of that character, it doesn't say one word. You know, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his one blue-eyed son. It doesn't go that way, does it? You know, there's no discussion of Jesus's hair color or length, eye color, skin tone. That's not in the Bible. Now, it's not because the Bible doesn't care about bodies. There's hemorrhaging women. There's leprous men. There's a body that's broken on a cross. Bodies matter, just not the way we think about the importance of bodies. But so the forensic scientists, this is what they came up with. If any of you seen the Michael Jackson video, Black or White, where there's like these morphine faces, that's kind of like, okay, he would have been brown-skinned, 5 feet tall, 100 pounds. That's what, the CSI people tell us. Or you can go catch a somewhat adequate quarterback who just happens to win one playoff game, and in GQ of all magazines, Tim Tebow will be referenced as a Christ analog. And then, of course, the next year, when Robert Griffin III is winning games for the Redskins, one of his players on his team says he's Black Jesus. So Tim Tebow can be Jesus without being referenced as white Jesus, and then RG3 can be Black Jesus. So we kind of get this everywhere. If you turn on the History Channel, you can watch the Bible miniseries where Jesus kind of looks like Brad Pitt, but so it's Jesus everywhere, and discussions about what the figure looks like. It doesn't matter that Jesus never threw a football. It matters this kind of physical image has come to bear, to be important. What I'm going to do for you for the next 30 minutes is I'm going to show you 3 scenes from popular culture. And we'll do 2 if I'm going long. Like if I notice you're falling asleep, we'll just do 2. Okay, you're going to be my bellwether. Okay, there you go. You're ready to go now. I'm going to show you 3 scenes, and then I'm going to unpack those scenes. These are television shows or movies that you might have seen, you might be familiar with, and they're going to show us 3 main things. 1, assumptions about the whiteness of Jesus have been created in the United States. We didn't inherit it from Europe. We made it. But whiteness has changed over time, and so has the image of Jesus as white. So the category of who's considered white, while people may think of racial categories as unchanging, they change often over time. Okay, and the assumptions, if race is about taking the universal, the massive array of human differences. We are all so different. Race is about creating categories to understand difference, and then creating hierarchies from those categories. So that when the police walk into a room, they're going to identify me as not the perpetrator. Okay, because of what they look like. They don't know that deep down I'm a really bad guy who loves money and I'll take it if I can get it. Okay, but identifying me as Caucasian has implications of meaning, of moral meaning. Okay, so race is about taking the whole variety of human difference, reducing it into categories, and then making meaning of them hierarchically. Okay, but we're going to find Jesus hasn't always been white, but then when he was made white was then changed over time. Secondly, there's a myth out there that people just make Jesus in their own image. Okay, so, white people make a white Jesus, black people make a black Jesus, Latino people make a Latino Jesus. The dolphins would make a dolphin Jesus if they could. Their thumbs aren't working the right way just yet. That's a myth. What we're going to find is that groups do not simply make Jesus in their own image, but realities of capital, literal money, technology, the ability to reproduce something, and production, that these all matter in which sacred images become known. Warner Salomon's Head of Christ, do you see that over the left? Is it any wonder to you that a very, very sophisticated publishing house in 1941 bought the rights to the image, and they made baseball card versions of it, and they donated it to the federal government, and had these images given to GIs who were going to fight over in World War II? And so they flooded the market, and then these gentlemen came home, and people started buying this image, that it's connected to the fact that they had the ability to create several million of these. Finally, since the 1960s, the white Jesus has been challenged in every way, shape, and form. Every media, every political group has challenged, has spoken explicitly against the whiteness of Jesus, except for Klan members. If you're a Klan member, thank you for coming. I look forward to your question at the end. But other than that, everyone else has moved in the direction to attack. But the white Jesus remains with us because of the weight of history. Because of the power associated with whiteness And the massive production of white Jesus images, when Family Guy puts Jesus there, they don't put a black Jesus. When Stephen Colbert has a Jesus on his show, it's not a black Jesus or even a Semitic-looking Jesus, like as if all Semites, all Jewish people look the same. Another kind of myth is that, oh, Jesus would have just looked like what anyone else what a Middle Eastern person looks like today is what Jesus would have looked like 2,000 years ago. Because we all know that people who live in an area look exactly the same over 2,000 years. I mean, that's true here, right? 2,000 years ago, we all looked like you and me here. So, no, people are massive amount of differences, change and morph over time of what people look like. So let's get into the 3 scenes. I'm going to start with The Office. If you know The Office, it's a show about a paper supply company in Scranton, Pennsylvania, run by, at one time, Michael Scott, who was the bumbling office manager. And here he is trying to get gum out of his hair. And I apologize, I'm going to fiddle with the technology here a little bit. But so we'll start with this first scene. The office has hired some new individuals. They've absorbed another branch. And it turns out one of those individuals is an ex-con. And the company gets kind of some federal money for employing an ex-con. But here's the problem. It happens to be the one African-American guy that they've newly hired. And Michael, who's always terrified, he's always very nervous about racial sensitivity, even though he himself is very racially insensitive, okay? So this is the background. He's very worried. Michael's very worried that the office won't accept this African-American ex-con who's now working there.
Close your eyes.
Okay. So there's a lot that's funny here, right? Michael's ridiculous sense of trustworthiness, right? So when Pam says her dad, he responds with Danny Glover, who's the African-American actor in Die Hard. And then, Jim, who we all want to be Jim. I always tell my students, I want to be Jim, I'm Michael. Okay, it's sad. But Jim writes jokes, Justin Timberlake, because Jim's going to play along with this silliness. And he says, Colin Powell. Okay, well, he was Secretary of State at the time. He's a decorated general. Maybe we could trust Colin Powell. And then Karen, my absolute favorite, Karen, says, Jesus. Now notice which category, racial category is Jesus in there? White. It's a white person you can name. And then Michael responds, Apollo Creed. Who doesn't know who Apollo Creed is? It's totally okay. Come on, who doesn't know? The guy on the left, that's Apollo Creed. The fictional black boxer in Rocky who beats Rocky in Rocky 1, loses to Rocky in Rocky 2, helps Rocky defeat Mr. T in Rocky 3, and then in Rocky 4, fast forward because it's sad. Okay? Carl Weathers is the actor who plays Apollo Creed. So somehow, Michael trusts Apollo Creed more than Jesus, right? But so notice that within the joke, there's a racialized assumption. Jesus was white, right? The joke only works. It only makes sense if Jesus is white. Well, there's a history to that. If you would have gone back in time 500 years, 400 years to what becomes the United States and said Jesus was white, that would have made no sense to people, okay? And one reason for this is the British people who founded, who kind of planted the colonies were radical iconoclasts, meaning they destroyed images of Jesus. They thought to imagine Jesus materially was a violation of the second commandment, which is against engraven images. So you can even look at their school primers. So here's a book called the New England Primer, and it's how to teach kids how to read, your ABCs. It's also to teach you you're gonna die, so you better be a good Christian. Okay, in Adam's sin, in Adam's fall, we all sinned, but then eventually you're gonna die. Okay, this is important in the New England Primer. Okay, but in the book, what you can see is that Jesus is absent and purposefully absent. So the letter C, what we see there is a cross in the background, but we never see actually Jesus. Even in the story of little Zacchaeus, you know, Zacchaeus, he was a tiny little man was he, climbed up on the sycamore tree, however the rest of the song goes. In British versions, you would see a little crowd of people with Jesus in the center, and Jesus was tall, was a little stick figure. Not in the colonial American versions. Zacchaeus, he did climb the tree, his Lord to see. That's how they had the S letter. They were crazy. But who do you not see? Jesus. Zacchaeus is there. Let me see if I can use the pointer thing. There's Zacchaeus. But Jesus isn't present. And when Puritans, these British colonists, would have a vision of Jesus in their dreams, he was behind a spider web. Or they described, I saw light, blinding light, and I couldn't see. Here's the thing. I know the word white and light sound really similar, but they're not the same. Seeing blinding light is not the same as seeing white. Any of you ever have in science class, or kind of grade school science class, your teacher asked, what color is water? And did anybody answer white as if it's milk? I did, because I wasn't very smart, okay? But light is not white. And for colonial Americans, if they ever beheld Jesus, they saw light, blinding light. In fact, Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, he had a theophany. That means a vision of God. Jesus and God came to him. And when Joseph Smith wrote about it in his diary, he said, I saw a light within light. He never referred to Jesus as white there. There's even examples on the ground of everyday people talking about, I don't know what Jesus was. In 1810, or in the 18-teens, a Native American named Corn Planter. Get this, Corn Planter's brother is named Handsome Lake. Okay? Oh, he's handsome. Who are you? I'm a ditch digger. It's kind of unfortunate, like the name the Anglos give him. But Corn Planter has a vision of Jesus. Jesus comes to the tribe. Okay, and they become Christians. They follow him. And Corn Planter is speaking to a missionary, Henry Simmons, and he says, it was the white people who killed our Savior. So he's saying, hey, I'm not going to trust you white people. We're going to be our Christians in our own way. The missionary, Henry Simmons, responded to him. He said, I told him it was the Jews who crucified or killed him, and whether they were white, red, or black, or what color they were of, I knew not. So who Jews were 2,000 years ago, what they looked like, Henry Simmons is saying, I don't know what they were. Or in the 1880s, we have a Presbyterian minister in New York City who in one sermon says, it's a remarkable thing in the history of Christ that nowhere have we any clue to his physical identity. Right? This guy's read his Bible. He knows it doesn't say anything there. The world owns no material portrait of his physical person. All the pictures of Christ by the great artists are mere fictions, right? David Gregg is saying, we don't know what Jesus looked like. And there's a lot of 19th century Protestants who are talking about that. They just don't know. Here's the problem. They can say one thing, but they're materializing another thing. Beginning in the 1820s, so about 30 years before the American Civil War, Americans start producing Jesus imagery. Here's the trick. They don't borrow it from Europeans. They don't say, that Da Vinci guy, he had a good code. And, we kind of like his art. They didn't know about Da Vinci or Michelangelo. They didn't know that stuff. They did know of a letter you've never heard of called the Publius Lentulus letter. They knew it was a fraud, too. The Publius Lentulus letter was a letter written in the 15th century, so during the Middle Ages. But it was supposedly a letter written during Jesus' lifetime, where a Roman writer, writes to a Roman governor and says, I met the man Jesus, and he had ripe skin and hair long to his shoulders, parted at the middle, a beard like his hair, parted in the center. When he looked at you, you felt awe or you felt love. In his face, I saw beauty and terror. But it's a fake. Everybody who's read it knows it's a fake. But in the early 19th century, white Americans start using it and saying, even if it's not true, we kind of like it. It's kind of pretty. And they start creating images like this one, which is modeled after the Publius Lentulus letter. Now, one of the rationale for it is always this. How do these, these children of iconoclasts rationalize? The argument is always children. They always say, you know what? If our kids don't convert, if they don't become good Christians, our American Republic will fall. Remember, we're a new nation at this time period. We're trying something, a republic that hadn't been tried before. And so lots of Protestant Christians are worried, if my kid doesn't become a Christian, they'll become just a terrible heathen, the country will fall into flames, and everything will be terrible. I gotta convince you when you're 2. Well, you can't read the Bible when you're 2, unless you're really smart, like Mike Light's kids, okay? But a kid can see a picture, and where do these images go? Well, they might go in your parlor, where you kind of read stories. You create affectionate bonds to an image. Do any of you, your first memories of Jesus, are they in a domestic sphere? Are they at your grandmother's house? Or are they your living room? Or a Sunday school? Or did you have a conversion experience and there was an image then you were attached to? The goal is to create affectionate bonds between the image and the child. And the reason for it is to let you know Jesus loves you, and to create a scenario, an atmosphere of love. But, when you put the sacred, if God takes one form and you put that into an image in 1830, well, guess what's happening with other bodies in 1830? The American slave trade is rising from 800,000 during the time of the American Revolution to about 4 million by 1860. Including an internal slave trade that will move 1 million African Americans from the coast to places like Georgia and then Texas. Well, you know who lived in Georgia? A group of Native Americans, Cherokee and Choctaw, many of whom who'd become Christians, who don't want to give up their lands. But Andrew Jackson, president at the time, and white Georgians who want the gold that's on their land start pushing them off. And Andrew Jackson is actually the first president to use a Christian argument during an annual address. If you read George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, they don't talk about Christianity in their annual addresses. Andrew Jackson does, and he says, you know what? The most Christian thing we can do is move them off the land. Oh, so the Trail of Tears is the most Christian thing we can do? So what do you do when you have African Americans see an image like that? And so when, in the American context of a racialized America where certain bodies have value, certain bodies can be bought and sold, certain bodies it's illegal to marry, that necessarily making Jesus look like this means making him not look like other people. And that has moral, political, social meaning in 1830 America. So we can move on, though, to whiteness changing over time. The Publius Lentulus letter in 1830, 1840, most white Protestant Americans had no problem with Jesus being Jewish. And the main reason for that is they don't know any Jews. Okay? There are hardly any Jewish Americans in America. After the American Civil War, from 1880 to 1920, we see a massive number of immigrants we have some from Asia, and we have many from Central and Eastern Europe. A lot of them are Jews. Partly you're running away from Russia. Many of you are Catholic. Many of you are Italian. Many of you might be Polish. So you come to the United States. You don't speak English. You may not have your holy day be on Sunday. What are you? According to naturalization laws, if you're white, you can become a citizen. But this question of who is white changes, okay? Or it becomes, people are asking this question by the 19-teens and 1920s. So for instance, R. Warren Conant in a book called The Virility of Christ, and what he's upset with is he hates how feminine Jesus appears. Okay, he doesn't like the images of Jesus with long hair and not tough. He wants Jesus to be like Teddy Roosevelt, okay? Not like, some little girl. But R. Warren Conant writes this: Why is it that we never think of Christ as a Jew? Because he was more Occidental than Oriental. Occidental in this case means Western European. Oriental means Middle Eastern. Okay, that's what the Orient for them was, the Middle East. And more cosmopolitan than either. Born of a race which has always been characterized by great excitability and volubility. Race is always about essentializing, saying people are always, this group that we've categorized is always this way. He was more like the best type of the modern Anglo-Saxon in his perfect self-command, his cool, steady eye, his capacity for reticence, and his love of brevity. Time out here real quick. So now Jesus, we don't think of him as a Jew. He's more Occidental than Oriental. He's actually more like an Anglo-Saxon. I mean, not just white, right, but a particular British version of white. But what does whiteness here mean? Does he say blue-eyed? Does he say blonde-haired? No, he doesn't say that because it's not in the Bible. Instead, for him, race is about performance. Race is about how you act, right? Perfect self-command, his cool, steady eye, his capacity for reticence, his love of brevity. So it's about what he says or what he doesn't say. In this case, Anglo-Saxonism isn't defined by blood quantum. It isn't defined by geography, where you're from, because if he did that, well, Jesus kind of lived in Israel as I understand it, right? He kind of didn't live in America. And so he has to redefine, when he wants to redefine Jesus as Anglo-Saxon, he kind of has to fall over himself, right? He has to take race off of the body and put it onto performance. And this is kind of one of the wrinkles of making Jesus white, is it has to be, in one sense, about talking about whiteness as something beyond geography and beyond blood lineage. And notice 1915, there's a very famous piece of artwork from Harold Copping called Hope of the World. Has anybody seen this before? Anybody seen this image? No? Oh, some of you have. Where did you see it, sir?
I'm not sure, but it's in the back of my head.
You remember it. You know what? You've heard the musical version of this image. Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world. Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. You've heard that song before? Written in the 1870s. It's a song about universal love, right? That Jesus loves all the children, all the racial categories of children. And when that song gets put to canvas, here's what Harold Copping does. He's a British artist, but it becomes extraordinarily popular in the United States. This is Jesus loving all the little children, right? He loves the white blonde girl on our right, so much so that he has his hand around her. He loves the Asian little boy with the hair, the queue in the back. He loves the Pacific Islander. One of the kids kind of stands out, doesn't he? The child to represent Africa and Africans and quote unquote what Harold Copping would have called Negroes. Notice there's a lot about this character, right? He has no clothes on. We don't see his face. And Jesus isn't touching him. Well, in Tennessee, a church school superintendent brings a whole mess of copies of this to her teachers. They're having a convention just like this, and she hands out copies. She says, I want you to bring this back to your church and put it in your Sunday school classrooms. And there's an African-American teacher there who says, well, excuse me, Miss Superintendent, why is the Negro boy not touching Jesus? And the superintendent responds, because your race is the furthest away from him. Okay? And we might find that, reprehensible at this point, but that's the reality of Britain, the United States, and lots of Western Europe at this time about racialized assumptions about who is sacred and who is not. And there was also, because of Darwinian evolutionary theory had then been used by social theorists to say racial groups can evolve over time. And Black African Americans, Africans are the lowest of the racial groups, and they just haven't advanced enough to become good white people, okay? Or at least even to these other positions. So notice here, though, who isn't white. Jews. There's a de-Semiticizing of Jesus at this time period. And it's after the 1920s we see the first American portraits of Jesus to not have brown eyes, but to have blue eyes. Go look at that Warner Solomon Head of Christ sometime. Go find a copy and look at the eyes. The eyes are blue. It's 1941. There's a lot of people using the phrase Nordic to discuss Jesus in the 1930s. That's the American version of the German word or German use of Aryan. So this non-Jewish, white, blue-eyed man as Jesus becomes not only popular, but put into material culture, which then is taught to those 2- and 3-year-olds who learn to associate a certain sacred body with blue eyes or white skin. Now, what's the impact of this? Because remember, if you're in the 1830s, you're a slave, guess what you don't have? You don't have time to say, how do I want to draw Jesus today? You don't have the productive capabilities to mass produce those images. You're not like, excuse me, master, I need to print 5,000 of these. Do you mind helping me? You don't have that time. You might sing songs about Jesus. Master Jesus owns me and I own him. It's kind of an interesting political statement, that I own the master in that case. But so for African Americans, what we find in the late 19th century is a whole bunch, when African Americans in their own churches start putting Jesus imagery there in stained glass windows or in Sunday school classes, they buy the stuff that's out there. So they buy white Jesus images. So much so that in 1940, a sociologist named E. Franklin Frazier publishes a study called Negro Youth at the Crossways. What he did, he's a sociologist who went and asked teenage African Americans, what color was God? Was Jesus a white man? So he asks this of African Americans in Louisville, Kentucky, and it's not Louisville, just so you all know, it's Louisville, and in Washington, D.C. And he gets a lot of different answers, but this is the most typical. Pictures I've seen of him are all white, so I took for granted he was a white man. Notice the answer. The student is not answering Jesus was. The answer is pictures. I've seen pictures of him. As a Jew, he might have been dark, but Jews are supposed to be white. So I guess that makes him white too? I guess it's kind of like I'm answering with a question, kind of. There's a lot that's fascinating about what E. Franklin Frazier was doing. One, he's kind of a terrible sociologist. Think about it. If you were to go do a survey, you don't ask leading questions, right? You might ask, what did Jesus look like? But you don't give them an answer. Was Jesus a white man? I mean, he's tipping off. He's already cueing you, in a sense. But then, what do we make of this? Does this young person actually answer definitively? Could that have been a question at the end, but we get a period because it's put into text? But notice, right, there's mitigating factors. They're pictures. What are Jews? He doesn't know. Well, there are dark Jews, but they're supposed to be white. They're supposed to be in a classification. For E. Franklin Frazier, what he argued was that his findings, his interviews showed this. Young African Americans have accepted a culture of white supremacy that even renders God and Jesus white. Now, while E. Franklin Frazier is doing that as a sociologist, there are two psychologists, named Kenneth and Mamie Clark, who at the exact same time are going to schools with younger African Americans and taking dolls. You guys have heard of this, the doll studies? Take a white doll and a black doll and ask, and here's a photograph of Kenneth Clark kind of observing, which is the good doll? Which is the bad doll? And what Kenneth and Mamie Clark found, or what they found in their study, was that young African American children privileged the white doll as likable, as good, as beautiful. And they actually mistreated the black doll. Now, we might just think, oh, these are just little studies, what importance might they have? Well, a little group of people called the Supreme Court, here's a case called Brown versus the Board of Education, which is a challenge to school segregation. And the thing that most convinces them that school segregation is unconstitutional isn't the fact that there's a whole bunch of law that demonstrates that it is. It's Kenneth and Mamie Clark's doll studies. And so on one hand, we have psychologists doing this doll study. We have E. Franklin Frazier making the same study about issues of Jesus. Or we can go to Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. 1953, he rises to fame. During the Montgomery bus boycott, he then becomes the head of an organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Well, when you're famous in the 1950s, people ask you to become Dear Abbeys, okay, to do advice columns. And so he becomes an advice columnist. Okay, you didn't know that, did you? That Martin Luther King Jr. was kind of a Dear Abby of the 1950s. Well, one writer in 1957 writes this: why did God make Jesus white when the majority of peoples in the world are non-white? So the assumption here isn't Jewish, isn't something else, white versus non-white. King's answer is so fascinating. On one hand, he articulates his political theology of it is the content of your character, not the color of your skin that matters. Kind of heard a line like that before? Kind of comes important in 1963. So notice his answer. The color of Jesus' skin is of little or no consequence, right? Color of skin doesn't have moral meaning. The whiteness or blackness of one's skin is a biological quality which has nothing to do with the intrinsic value of the personality. The significance of Jesus lay, just like in all of you, not in his color, but in his unique God consciousness and his willingness to surrender his will to God's will. He was the Son of God, not because of his external biological makeup, but because of his internal spiritual commitment. Okay, we like that, right? Race doesn't matter. What you look like doesn't matter. What your skin, your hair, any of it, that doesn't say who you are. It's your inner consciousness. It's the content of your character. But notice this last sentence, or last two. He would have been no more significant if his skin had been black. He is no less significant because his skin was white. One reader reads it and writes back and says, Dear Reverend King, I appreciate that, I agree with you that Jesus' skin shouldn't matter. What leads you to believe that his skin was white? King never responds. Okay? But notice here, even in this civil rights hero of ours, there's this assumption, that naturalized assumption that Jesus is white. The same assumption that'll make that Office episode funny. If we didn't have that assumption to begin with, it wouldn't be funny in The Office. In this case, this isn't funny, right? This isn't comedy. This is the most serious stuff they're discussing. What's the relationship between God and our racial structure of Jim Crow segregation? Now we're going to switch to the second example, okay, the second pop culture example. It comes from a show called Good Times. Anybody remember Good Times? I mean, you were all too young, but J.J. Dynamite Walker, okay? It was a show written by the same people who wrote All in the Family, which you may not remember the title, but you remember one character, a guy named Archie Bunker. You've heard of him? Okay, so the same people who did Archie Bunker do Good Times. It's a show in the 1970s. They live pretty much in like the projects in Chicago. The second episode is titled Black Jesus. JJ is a painter, and there's basically what's coming up is there's going to be an art award for kind of the best painting to commemorate Black History Week or Black History Month. So this is him deciding with his young brother what should he submit to this painting award. Okay. So there's a lot going on in that whole scene. I think a few things that it shows us is, one, notice how hard it is for him to create art. Remember, it's like, oh, if I want to paint something new, what do I have to do to paint something new? I've got to go downtown to buy art supplies. I've got to take the bus. But if I don't have any money to buy art supplies, I then have to steal from the rich, like Robin Hood. So first of all, it's not that everyone can just create whatever image they want. Then notice the young brother has never seen an image of a black Jesus before. Notice what image they have on the wall to begin with. Warner Sallman's head of Christ. is on their wall. And notice who's not going to be happy about this. Not some random white person they know, their mom. Okay, there might be a generational divide here as to what type of image you could want. So there's where historically do we find a non-white Jesus? Because we have throughout American history people questioning, challenging, like, oh, well, maybe we don't know what Jesus looked like, or he could have looked like anything, and then we have people making him white. But how about specifically colored, or non-white, or black in this case? Well, there's actually a history there that's fascinating as well. The first American to specifically say that Jesus was colored was not an African-American person. It was a Methodist Pequot named William Apes. And in the 1830s, he wrote an essay called An Indian's Looking Glass for the White Man. He wanted to put a glass in front of you, a prism to you white people to say, here's what the world looks like from our worldview. And his main attack, his main enemy was the new visual arts of white Jesuses. And he says, you know just as I do that the Savior you follow was not in white skin, but in colored skin, and his apostles as well. Now, for William Apes, it's not just about, oh, that you just happen to make Jesus look white, and that's not true. There are consequences for that imagery. For instance, where people like me can live, that you don't want your daughters to marry men who look like me. He even brings up interracial marriage and those who would be against it as a consequence of making Jesus white. And in fact, it's not till 1967 that the United States Supreme Court outlaws state laws that had interracial marriage as illegal. In fact, after the Civil War in the state of Mississippi, it is an executable offense for a white woman to marry an African-American man. So the same people who thought it wasn't an executable offense to wage war against the country, you can be a traitor, but you can't have sex across the color line. Okay? So for William Apes, though, in the 1830s, he's already identifying a politics about the white Jesus that are made, but then explicitly saying, no, Jesus was colored. Then we can move forward into the early 20th century. In the early 20th century, as African Americans moved, large numbers of African Americans moved from the South to the North in what we call the Great Migration. Okay? We see the rise of these African American communities in northern cities, whether it's Grand Rapids, or whether it's in Harlem, or whether it's Chicago or Detroit. And once they're collected, and they can have some capital, some time, you're not slaves anymore, so you have some time to yourself, you create a pro-African-American culture. And one of the things that's created is a black Jesus. But notice, you now have the actual space to do it. You have the resources to do it. So if you were to go get The Crisis is the magazine for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It's not like a church magazine. It's not something produced by the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Its editor is a guy named W.E.B. Du Bois, who you might have heard of, who authored The Souls of Black Folk. Every December, you're going to see basically an image of a black Madonna and a black Jesus child. Or you can turn to the poetry of Langston Hughes, who wrote a poem in 1931 called Christ in Alabama. For Du Bois and for Langston Hughes, the analog, the Jesus of America, was the lynch victim. From 1880 to 1920, as those new immigrants were coming to the United States, we can open a newspaper, turn the one newspaper day 1, day 2, day 3. By day 3 to day 5, you'll read about a lynching. An extra-legal, brutal mob murder, typically of an African-American man. That's what gets in the newspapers. What happened actually on the ground? How many African-Americans were lynched? Ida B. Wells, an African-American woman, wrote that she thought it was about 10,000 black men lynched between the end of the Civil War and 1930. Okay, but so the lynch victim, here he is, this black man in a cotton field, becomes the analog for Christ in America, for Harlem Renaissance writers. But there's a wrinkle here. It's not all black people participating in the making of a black Jesus. The artist who made that Christ in Alabama piece of work there is a guy named Prentice Taylor. He was a white guy, okay? William Lloyd Garrison, an abolitionist, a white abolitionist during the 1860s, wrote that the Christ of American civilization is the slave. There were white Americans who also pictured or considered Jesus to be somehow affiliated, whether it's with slaves or with African American lynch victims. Marcus Garvey would say to his followers, never admit that Jesus was white. Jesus was made in the, image of God. God made all of humanity, and humanity was made in God's image. That means God has within himself white people, black people, Asian people. In America, that means you're Negro. Never admit that Jesus was a white man. Jesus was a Negro, is what Marcus Garvey would tell you. And so we see in the 19-teens, 1920s, a whole bunch of African Americans not only writing that and with some of their white supporters, but visualizing it as well. Then, by the time of the modern civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, as African Americans are challenging every piece of Jim Crow society, whether it's sit-ins to say, hey, we can eat here or we can swim here, whether it's the law and challenging disenfranchisement, there's also a move in theology and church life. In Detroit, Reverend Albert Cleage is so frustrated with white people because of their responses to Brown versus the Board of Education. In fact, the state of Virginia, the white people in Virginia, were so adamantly opposed to school integration that they closed their public schools for an entire year, which, as a parent, sounds like a terrible idea, okay? Because that means you have to watch your own kid. But that's how dedicated they are to not having integrated schools. So Albert Cleage renames his church and calls it the Shrine of the Black Madonna. And he creates this thing called Black Christian nationalism, where he says, hey, we black Christians have to join together and form our own nation. And he prays at one point, and he says, dear member of the FBI who's in the audience, I know you're recording me, but I want you to hear, and God, I want you to know that we cannot pray to you if you were white, that we could only follow a black God. We see other writers like theologian James Cone, who talks about Jesus as black, not physically black, but black symbolically. That Jesus sided symbolically with the oppressed. God became man, not an imperial Rome soldier, but an oppressed minority. He chose symbolic sides. So when he says Jesus is black, he means symbolically black. Or we get J. Diotis Roberts, who's another black liberation theologian who says, hey, what we need to have is a black Jesus for our uplift and a universal raceless Jesus for all of us. Because the goal is our uplift and community, right? To have a beloved community. And then in 1969, we see Ebony, again, not a church periodical, right? You know, you open up Ebony and there's like, oh, here's an advertisement for cigarettes and a car, then here's a story about what's going on in Motown, some good music. But in March 1969, it's the quest for a black Christ. This is 1969. It's only going to be 4 years later that Good Times is going to have its episode of Black Jesus. Okay. But what I want you to see here is there's emerging that African Americans are more robustly talking about having black Jesus, or Jesus as non-white and explicitly African American. We can go to Detroit in 1967, where during civil rights agitation, a group of African American young people go up to a Sacred Heart and they paint the face, the hands, and the feet. Even notice the feet, they got their detail, right? Black. The next day, a group of white young people repaint it white. The next day, the African American men and women repaint it black. That in fact, the civil rights struggles are even mapping themselves onto imagery of Jesus that's out there in white marble. And then we can fast forward to 1999. And the award-winning piece by an artist named Janet McKenzie called Jesus of the People, where Janet McKenzie is a white Episcopalian from New York. But the 20th century tide of depicting Jesus as non-white, as maybe colored, maybe black, she gets here a kind of racially indeterminate Jesus, right? Is that Jesus African American? Is it Native American? Notice the Native American symbols in the back. Is that Jesus a man? Janet McKenzie positions this art in a gallery of 50 African American women portraits. Okay? And so, but Janet McKenzie has followed in this line of imaging. Now, statistically, when sociologists study what do African Americans actually think on the ground, what was the race of Jesus? Unlike E. Franklin Frazier, who found these young people finding Jesus to be white, 7% of African Americans in the 1990s said Jesus was white, but only 20% said Jesus was black. Most of them said Jesus was non-racial. And I read that as partly, hey, we know what it's like. We know what the experience of having a racialized Jesus, a white Jesus, what it does. It denigrates people like us. So, but we're not going to then re-racialize Jesus in our own image, because that's a loser's game. Nobody wins at that. The last scene I want to show you is where I'm going to end, okay? And it's with 21 Jump Street. Who's seen 21 Jump Street? Okay, you know it's not a good movie. It's really not that funny. Anybody really disagree with me? It's like, okay. You liked it?
I loved it.
You loved it. But I want to apologize in advance. This has swearing in the scene, okay? But it's only a minute. I'm gonna show this video, and then I'm gonna open it up to questions, because I know you're getting tired. It's dark in here. It's warm. My voice is so soothing. It's like listening to rain falling, and you know. So we'll watch this scene, and then we'll do kind of discussion. But I want you to see this scene because I think it's just so fascinating. But I apologize for the swearing. Earmuffs if you don't like swearing. We can talk about that scene, or we can just open it up. Excuse me, to your questions and thoughts. One thing really quickly I want to tell you. I don't like the game ping pong. So I'm actually not going to do that with your questions. What I'm going to do is allow, like someone will have a question, and I'm going to say, oh, and then we're going to have another question, and then another question, and we're going to group it together. And if you have an answer to someone's question, like someone says something and you think, oh, I think this, get in line, and then you can use your question as a time to answer to them. Okay? So who has the first, who wants to just start us? This individual here.
If you have a question, wait for the microphone.
Do we have a second microphone or no? Okay, thanks, sir. Yes?
Can you discuss a little bit the picture that's been on the side throughout the presentation?
Okay, the Warner Solomon Have Christ. Okay, other? I know it's going to feel weird that I'm not playing ping pong, but your question will get answered. Right there.
Would it be correct for me to purport that your disposition on people using any type of phenotypical representation of Jesus is for an agenda?
Isn't it weird having someone not answer?
Related, was it purposeful or an omission about the lack of definition of Jesus's phenotype from a biblical accounting, given that one would assume that much of art was done in the time, but why was that not given attention to? Purposeful or omitted?
Okay, so one of the questions we have here is purpose. And we can use this example. So the image up here to the top is Warner Salmon's Head of Christ. He was the son of Swedish immigrants to Chicago. He was a kind of schlocky artist who was kind of okay. His teacher at Moody Bible Institute said, we need a more manly Jesus. And that's what he gave us. Okay? Now, he painted Jesus he followed artistic precursors, mostly the Sacred Heart, if any of you know the Sacred Heart. But unlike the Sacred Heart where Jesus looks at us, this Jesus has a heroic gaze off into the distance, like he's supposed to do something. Gave him blue eyes, nothing in the background, no like palm trees, so you're like, what, am I in San Diego? So you could, and this image then goes in living rooms. Is it purposeful, an image of white supremacy? Absolutely not. That was not what Warner Solomon was purposefully doing. What he was doing was trying to give a Jesus image that Catholics and Protestants could use for their churches, for their Sunday schools, and mostly to let children know Jesus loves you, he cares about you, and he has a mission for you. Now, so in the book that I wrote with another historian, we write about the implications of the image given a racial society, where it's a Jim Crow society, and what that would mean for people who don't look like that. Now, real quick, Warner Solomon doesn't look like that guy. Warner Solomon is picture me, bald, and even a little uglier, all right? That's what Warner Solomon looked like. He didn't have long flowing hair, a beard. He didn't even kind of look like that phenotypically, the rest of it. But so is there an agenda? No. Sometimes there's an agenda, sometimes. Are there outcomes? Yes. Now, the Bible writers, I'm gonna be honest with you, what Matthew, Mark, Luke, John were thinking, I have no idea, okay? So now, why did early Christians create Jesus imagery? No. Not because of partly because Romans are the ones who made images. They put statues. But when you're in catacombs, the last thing on your mind is I need to produce some great piece of art. Or you're in the Colosseum, and it's this lion might kill me, but I've been thinking about this painting. For the first couple hundred years, Christians are another oppressed minority group, and they don't have the capital or the time. And then the first Jesus images, most of them are things like Jesus as a lion, not as actually human. So, next set of questions or comments.
A couple of thousand years ago, as Buddhism spread beyond South Asia through the Silk Roads into China, the face of the Buddha began to, in sculpture, appear more East Asian than South Asian. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if in your research you have found comparisons or differences maybe between different confessions of Christianity or maybe other world religions as well. Are there similar dynamics going on? And then what does that tell us about a historical pattern, perhaps?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
It was kind of with the 21 Jump Street is across the world, is there really more of a Korean Jesus, or is that painting more worldwide?
Mm-hmm. And then we have this gentleman up here. Keep your hand up.
I was just wondering, you said that these pictures of Jesus that were created with him white, they started off in America. How did that transfer over to Europe? How did that impact Europe? What was that cross-cultural sort of, consequence of him becoming white?
So clearly, there are European expressions of Jesus looking, if you go ahead, read, look at Da Vinci's work or Michelangelo's. Medieval and then Renaissance painters were hyper-local artists. It means they made everyone around them look like their locality, except for El Greco. El Greco actually went and got Jewish kids to be his Jesus images. So Americans do not import that European art until around the 1880s, and then they start importing it, okay? Then in the 20th century, we become the main exporters of Jesus imagery, especially in film. Think about it, where does the Passion of the Christ come from? It's filmed in Italy, but it comes from an American film producer, Mel Gibson, with an American actor, Jim Caviezel, JC, wink, wink. But that goes to this question of, okay, globally, at different times, what does Jesus look like? There are definitely iterations of Jesus in Asia looking Asian. And there are some even within the United States that figure Jesus as looking like Chinese. There are Asian American and Asian theologians who talk about Jesus as, with phenotypical Asian-looking features. But if we were to go, oftentimes throughout the world, whether it's Africa or different parts of China, and put up a poster that had a white Jesus on it, there would be people locally who would actually go up and touch it as if it's sacred. One of the reasons for this is the most seen movie in the world by 1 billion people is not The Avengers, it's not Titanic, it's a movie titled Jesus. It was produced by Campus Crusade for Christ in 1970. Every single character's a Middle Eastern actor, except for Jesus, who's an Englishman. Okay? Even though it's a translated film, it's been seen by 1 billion people, mostly in Africa, throughout Asia. And so what we find, even photographers have shown this, that there's lots of these places where they see this white Jesus in a poster and they think it's him. In San Francisco, the first Chinese-American church, if you were to go and enter there, you'd open the door and you would see Warner Sallman's Head of Christ as you walk in. Okay? As almost, not as a gatekeeper, but almost kind of feels that way. And so, so just kind of some of the answers. Next set of fun questions. Yeah, in the back. And anybody else in front? I mean, you have to be here. Ask a question.
Would you be kind enough to comment on the role of the Shroud of Turin in influencing perceptions of the image of Jesus?
Yeah. Other questions?
What made you want to study this and write a book on it? Like, what was
the Shroud of Turin. No. So, okay. So the Shroud of Turin is not something. It tends to be. It plays an extraordinarily important role for many Catholics in their notions of the Stations of the Cross, okay? And it's mostly become now, in the kind of late 20th century, just this kind of fun, debated kind of piece like, ooh, do we actually have some vestige of whether it was what Jesus looked like or his sweat or something? It's kind of become a little bit like, do we have any evidence? What's the proof? Can we have some actual proof that Jesus existed? Notice that Jonah Hill, his character here, he says, I don't know if I actually believe you existed. So it's become, on one hand, an issue of apologetics, of how do we prove Jesus actually even existed? Because the materials we have aren't directly, he didn't write anything. And so the Shroud of Turin does play a role in things like when we get to Veronica, St. Veronica's image or vision. But it's not typically then used, like very few people have like a Shroud of Turin in their image in their living room or something like that. Why did I write it? So I was starting to have kids. And I'm a historian of race and religion, and I've always been fascinated by how certain groups are presented as kind of more sacred than others. And I'm having kids, and I'm like, what does it mean to be 6 months and mom's holding you at church? And you're singing, Jesus loves me, and everyone's singing, and there's a white guy on the wall. What does it mean to learn an affectionate bond to a particular sacred body? Does that have a deep psychological impact? That certain bodies then have value and other bodies don't. I believe I grew up in a time that valued white bodies culturally. Okay? When I grew up, I thought Andie MacDowell was the most beautiful woman in the world. She's not the most beautiful woman in the world. It's because I saw her in commercials everywhere, and I associated whiteness with beauty. I didn't want my kids to value certain bodies as sacred and other bodies as not. So that's why I wrote this, because I wanted to give a history to it that, hey, if you can give a history to something, that means it hasn't existed forever. Other questions or thoughts? We're going to stay till 8:30 just because I'm just mean that way. So we can sit quietly for 7 minutes.
What does the child that's been on the screen have to do with any of this?
Good question. Questions from here, because we have a mic right here. Oh, over here, this gentleman again. Yeah, that's fine. Oh.
My question is, do you see the image of Christ changing in modern times? Also, I know like in Latin America, they hold Mary, the Virgin Mother, in really high regard. And how does imagery of her play into all of this?
Yeah, so who's the kid and what about the mom? You know, these are kind of important questions. So Our Lady of Guadalupe, has anybody heard of her? She's a mestiza Madonna. So when the Spanish interact with Native Americans, within 100 years, 150 years, there's this vision of a Madonna, that the Madonna comes and reveals herself sacredly. And she's brown in this new mestiza world that's coming. And so we see already from the first engagements with the New World that European Christianity is transformed racially, and we get a mestiza sacred figure among Spanish Catholics and among Native American Catholics that emerges and continues to be extraordinarily popular. No joke, among Latina Catholics, Our Lady of Guadalupe would win in a popularity contest with the Pope. No, 2-1, 3-1, okay? Now, when we go from mom to child, who is this African-American boy? The year's 1967. He is the king of the Sunday school, and there's a parade on the streets of Brooklyn, okay, which had erupted earlier in race struggles. And he's being pushed through the streets by his African-American friends. They're 12 years old. They're pushing him through the streets. He's the king, but above him is the King of Kings, Christ, Lord of all. And that's Werner Sallman's Head of Christ. It's the book cover because this hierarchical photography forces you to look at one person or the other. Horizontal photography allows you to look at everybody. It's hard when something's vertical to look at both. We wanted to write in the book, the point of the book is you've got to choose which body you value. Does this kid, 12 years old in 1967, does his body matter? Or does this non-living, two-dimensional body, is that what matters more to you? Would you rather have that picture in your church or that kid in your church? That's kind of what the work of that image is doing for me. The photographer is a guy named William Gedney. He didn't write anything about the photograph. He just took it. He was a professional photographer and went into an archive. I also think it's interesting, you can't see it there, his friends are pushing him, that there's work involved in all this religious culture, energy. Other questions? Because I want you to leave, also the cover is there, do not leave this, if you leave here and say, well, everyone just makes Jesus look like themselves. Really? Because I don't think that black kid and that guy look anything alike. Maybe you do. But that's the image they use. Okay, we got 3 minutes. So you've saved your best comments or questions. Do we have a score update on any of the basketball games? Who's playing? Is Michigan playing right now or MSU? Tomorrow. Oh, tomorrow. So no one of importance is playing. Did Detroit, did they sign Verlander to keep him? I'm looking at you because you have a Tigers hat on. No? Final questions. Thoughts, worries, laments. Give me the lights real quick just to show the last images. Because you asked, one of the questions was, is the image of Jesus changing? Yeah, something new in your lifetime's emerging. The brownness of Jesus is becoming a regular refrain. Even Billy Graham said in 1999, Jesus was not a white man. And go on Google. This is what happens in a Google image search if you search for black Jesus. You can find, remember in 1973 in Good Times, the young boy couldn't find, this was the first black Jesus he's ever seen. Just go on Google image, you can find a whole bunch of them. Or heck, how about Ninja Jesus? We can even find a whole bunch of Ninja Jesuses out there. But here's the power of history. Look at the search words. Did I type in white Jesus? Jesus Christ. And that's what you get. Warner Solomon's Head of Christ is there, a few other largely white Jesuses. Because history, because there's been so many white Jesuses produced and then scanned, that people had power, technological power, even in our algorithms, is the normative sense that Jesus was white. And if you want a non-white Jesus, you can find one, but you have to be explicit to locate it. We can throw the lights back on. If there are no other questions, if there are no other thoughts, I thank you so much for joining me and having me. And I hope you all have good evenings.